I think we are ready to start now. So welcome everybody to the first lecture of the second webinar series on the pre-modern Islamic manuscripts organized by the Nomad's Manuscript Landscape project here at the Institute of Iranian Studies of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. This is the second year we're running these webinars. We are very happy and very excited about the program for this year. I recommend you to look at the website for the forthcoming lectures as well throughout the academic year 22-23. My name is Bruno De Nicola. I am the principal investigator in this project that is financed by the FWF, the Austria Wissenschaft Fonds. And as a reminder of how we're going to be doing this, for those that are new today, we will have a talk of 45 minutes by our invited lecturer. And then that will be followed by Q&A, and they will have different ways in which you can participate after the talk. You can place your question at the chat option, or in the Q&A option you will find at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom, or you can also raise your hand and I will allow you to come in and verbalize your question to the speaker as well. So 3 options about that. We're going to be recording this lecture today, but not the Q&A. I will stop the recording once the lecturer finishes his talk. So today we have the pleasure of having or introducing Dr. Stefan Kamola. He's an associate professor of history at Eastern Connecticut University in the United States, but currently he is with us here in Vienna as a fellow of the Lisa Meitner program, also financed by the FWF here in Austria. So we have him here for 2 years with this program at the Institute of Iranian Studies in Austria. We are very happy for that. He's a specialist on Mongol history, as you know, Persian historiography, and also on Persian manuscripts. He has written different articles, but perhaps you know him more for his great book, Making Mongol History, Rashid al-Din and the Jami al-Tawarik, published with Edinburgh University Press in 2019. During the last few years, Stefan has been continued researching on Rashid al-Din and historiography in the medieval Persian world in general, but he also moved into looking at astrology in this period, which is the topic of today's lecture we are very excited about. So the title of today's lecture is Astrology in Mongol Iran, Foreign Fascination or Popular Pastime. Stefan, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay first?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. Thank you, Bruno, for that introduction. I will say that, well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here with us. I'm happy to be here in Vienna and to be working on this sort of a new project for me. This project emerged as sort of it's part of a larger collaboration that Bruno and I have going with a number of other people looking into this strange little Zoroastrian apocalyptic tradition from the Mongol period that I'll talk a little bit about in a little bit. And that raised some questions for me that I thought I needed to dig into. And, I started scratching that itch and came up with some new ideas. Well, some ideas at least. I will say I wasn't supposed to present this until January or so. So some of my points may be a bit hypothetical, but I'm looking forward to discussion. I'm looking forward to some ideas for how to move this project forward. I want to start with something that I think we all can agree on, those of us who work on the Mongols in Iran or the history of astral sciences, and that is that Hülegü paid for the building of an observatory complex at Maraga and put Nasser-Din Tusi at the helm. The Maraga Observatory Complex, of course, became one of the most important institutions in the development of modern astronomy, especially in the development of planetary models. I was happy to see several people with expertise in the history of science and astronomy among the participants, so I look forward to hearing more from them. After that point, however, people start to diverge about what the motives were lying behind Hülegü and Tusi in their decision to, first of all, join forces, and secondly, to found the Observatory of Maraga. So just to give a few sort of senses of why is my slide Okay, here we go. Some idea of some of the scholarly attitudes that have been voiced about this. I'll begin with the great Mujahid of Mongol studies, Thomas Olson, his 2001 book, where he writes that the interest in astronomy, I've just put some sort of representative quotes here on the screen, widespread among the Chinggisids was evident among the Ilkhans from the advent of their state, and so on and so forth. He says, he quotes Kashani to say that Hülegü loved science and was infatuated with astronomy and geometry. In fact, in his entire chapter on astral sciences, Olson never once mentions astrology, and he focuses very much on sort of the more mathematical science of astronomy. I'll talk a little bit about that distinction in a few minutes. And this makes sense really with Olson's larger project of presenting the Mongols as sort of rational, engaged agents of intellectual exchange across Eurasia, but I think it lands a little wide of the mark. 5 years later, George Saliba published a really interesting thought piece about, looking into this exact question of why it was, or what Hülegü had in mind, and how much astrology meant to him and to Tusi. And where Saliba came down pretty much was the idea that Hülegü's support of astrology was very practical. We get the sense from Saliba that astrology served as one more sort of technology of spiritual insurance for the Mongols, another way to sort of assure that they had all their bases covered, but that Hülegü wasn't going to go out of his way to support astrology. And Tusi used this opportunity then to sort of create the dream institution, sort of the ideal research organization for pursuing his more sort of formal and sober astronomical works. A few years after that, Hadi Jaradi's dissertation also touches on this topic. I'm happy to see Hadi among the participants, so please let me know if I'm misrepresenting your work at all. And Hadi writes that if the Mongols' devotion to astrology and astrological prognostication was so widely known, Tusi must have known well before their arrival at Alamut that this was his ticket to a safe position and secure employment with the Mongols. So again, the idea that there's very much a political component to this, and that astrology is sort of a convenient place to meet the Mongols and sort of pursue larger projects. Very recently, Tawfiq Haidarzadeh chapter has finally been published. This was from a paper that he presented in 2014, where he basically he demonstrates, I think, in a really clever way, that during his time working for the Ismailis, that is, before the coming of the Mongols, before the coming of Hülegü, that Tusi really wasn't involved in observational astronomy at all, and so there was no reason really for him to be hired specifically in that role. And really, what Tawfiq raises is this idea that he points out that Tusi was actually engaged in astrological work under the Ismailis, and that it was probably for this reason that the Mongols even knew about him in the first place. So we have a whole range of ideas about how astrology fit into this relationship that developed between Hülegü and Nasruddin Tusi. And just to summarize, basically, either the Mongols did or did not want astrology and astrologers, and Tusi either did or did not want to practice astrology for the Mongols. So that's kind of where we're starting at for today. So this raises the question, my basic question for the day, which is, what was the role of astrology in the founding of the Ilkhanate? There's several questions involved in this. I've already raised this question of motivation. How motivated was Hülegü by the idea of astrology? How motivated was Tusi by the practice of astrology? What role did it play in the two of them knowing about each other and deciding to work together? And then what role did it play in their decision, whoever's idea it was, to build this observatory at Maraga? So to approach these questions, I want to look at three historical processes. The first of these is just the long-term development of astral sciences in Southwest Asia, from the Hellenistic period up to the time of Nasruddin Tusi, up to the 13th century, including the relationship between astronomy and astrology over that period of time. Secondly, and sort of emerging from that, related to that point, is the changing ways that we see people engaging with astrology as its relationship to astronomy changed over time. And here, I suggest that we see a general popularization of astrology, which makes it accessible in certain ways and able to be used in certain ways exactly in the Mongol period that weren't really available in previous centuries. And then finally, I want to look at Mongol ideas about astrology, which have either, they've been treated anywhere from what we already saw Thomas Olson's position being that the Mongols were really into astronomy and good mathematical science. Olson really focuses on the Mongols' interest in developing new calendars and the need to sort of manage all these calendars that they suddenly had to juggle as they governed all of Eurasia. So we see everything from that to the other extreme, which is that the Mongols were simply sort of woo-woo shamanist, head in the clouds, sort of, I don't know, new age spiritualists who just wanted their horoscopes read. And what I'm going to try to show is that we can actually historicize Mongol ideas about astrology and about Western astrology specifically to see how Hülegü, what would have been on his mind specifically when he arrived in Iran in the 1250s. Okay, so I want to begin with an anecdote that always comes up in studies of Mongol astrology. It's a very well-known anecdote, but I'm going to bring it up because it brings up some of the problems that we're facing. And this comes to us from Rashid ad-Din, and I promise this is the only place I'll talk about Rashid ad-Din today. And it's his narrative about the campaign to Baghdad. And Hülegü consults with his ministers and advisors. They all have different things to say. And so he summons his astrologer, Hüsam ad-Din, who had accompanied him at the Kaghan's order, so his brother Munk's order, to choose auspicious times for mounting and dismounting. And he said, "Tell me without dissimulation everything that appears in the stars." Since the astrologer held an intimate enough position to be bold, he said in absolute terms to the Padishah, neither to attack the house of the Caliphate nor to lead an army to Baghdad is auspicious, for until now no ruler who has attacked Baghdad and the Abbasids has enjoyed either kingdom or life. And he goes on to list these 6 great catastrophes that will happen if Hülegü invades Baghdad. Of course, Hülegü's advisors and his military commanders disagreed. They said that going to Baghdad was the very best policy. So he summons Nasr ad-Din Tusi and consults with him. The Khwaja, Nasr ad-Din, was apprehensive and thought that it was some sort of test. And he says, none of these things will happen. Then what will happen, Hülegü asked? Hülegü Khan will take the caliph's place, he replied. After that, Hülegü summoned Hüsam ad-Din and had him debate with Khwaja Nasr ad-Din. All Islamic people are agreed, so this is Nasr ad-Din speaking, all Islamic people are agreed that some of the great companions of the Prophet were martyred, and no catastrophe appeared. If it is claimed that this is some special characteristic of the Abbasids, well, Tahir came from Khorasan by order of Mahmud and killed his brother Amin. The emirs conspired and killed one of Mutawakkil's son, and Muntazir and Mumtaz were killed by emirs and slaves. Several other caliphs were also killed by various persons, and no catastrophe befell. So I just want to raise a few issues from this anecdote because it gets frequently related and I think never really fully dissected. It raises certain questions that are going to be with us for the course of the presentation. First of all, who is Hüsam ad-Din? Right? Where is this guy from? An individual with an Arabic name who's been in Hülegü's entourage by 1257 long enough to speak boldly out of confidence for his position. And by contrast, if Tusi was as in demand as Rashid ad-Din even tells us he was, elsewhere Rashid ad-Din says that Monke wanted Tusi to come work in Karakoram and Hülegü decided not to send him. If that's the case, why is it that Nasr ad-Din Tusi has to be so circumspect in his language? Why is he so uncertain about his position? And finally, and this is the real kicker, why doesn't Nasr ad-Din cast a horoscope here, right? We see that Nasr ad-Din's response to Hüsam ad-Din is not voiced in the sense of astrology, but rather as a historical argument, right? He's more of a historian and a dialectician than an astrologer here in this last paragraph. In a way, Rashid ad-Din sort of presents Tusi more like himself than like the astronomer or astrologer that modern historians tend to focus on. So those are just sort of some of the concepts that we're going to be dealing with. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I don't have any interesting slides for a little while. But I want to turn now to my first point, my first historical process, which is the development of astral sciences. And again, a lot of this is going to be just sort of overview, but hopefully it'll lay the groundwork for some of the basic concepts. So the astral sciences, astronomy and astrology have been paired disciplines since antiquity. So I'm using this term astral sciences and I'm using the terms astronomy and astrology. And by that, what I mean, when I use the term astronomy, I'm referring to an observational science, which is based on observing the heavens, taking measurements, and then modeling the movement of planets and sort of predicting or figuring out mathematical models for understanding the movement of heavenly bodies. Astrology then takes that information and turns it towards the human realm, and astrology is sort of the application of astronomical knowledge to see that it's based on the idea that those movements out there that can be modeled must have some sort of relevance to the world. It makes sense to have them paired in a geocentric model of a geocentric cosmology where the entire universe is believed to revolve around the Earth, and therefore anything that happens around it must be sort of aimed at and focused on the mundane sphere. Okay, so these two sciences are paired since antiquity. But there's always been sort of a problem with astrology. And this problem is recognized as early as Ptolemy, really in the founding document of astrology, the Tetrabiblios. And that problem is that astrology really isn't provable in the same way that astronomy is, right? So it's based on the measurements of astronomy. It's based on certain observations about the fact that the sun makes things hot. The moon tends to, at night, things cool off. Those are sort of the broadest term observations that lead into astrology. But Ptolemy already recognizes that the patterns that astrology is built out of repeat on such large timescales that no one individual is able to observe and test any of these observations. And so there's a real problem with considering astrology in the same way as astronomy, but that doesn't bother Ptolemy so much. Essentially, his solution is that, yeah, astrology needs to be understood as being, fallible and kind of iffy and uncertain, but that doesn't mean we should reject it. It's sort of self-evidently true, and we can make as much sense of it as we can. Bruno offered the analogy to modern psychoanalysis or psychology, right? That we don't actually really know what's going on in our minds, but we can still make something of it. So the Ptolemaic tradition, the Hellenistic tradition of astral sciences, along with the Mesopotamian and the Indian and Iranian traditions, all get drawn together during the Sasanian period in various centers of learning, and really turned into a central core element of the Sasanian ideological program, which was centered on this idea of gathering and translating and sponsoring knowledge. And that project is then picked up by the Abbasids. Here, of course, I'm leaning on the work of Dimitri Gutas, where we hear about astronomy and astrology coming through as one of the early, really the first science patronized by the Abbasids as part of their ideology of knowledge production. And the 8th and 9th centuries, therefore, is really kind of the golden age of Arabic astrology and astronomy, astral sciences in general, where individuals like Masha'Allah and Naubacht are working at the caliphal court to take measurements of the sky, but also to, cast horoscopes. We hear of the horoscope for the city of Baghdad being cast by a team of astrologers, for example. And I'll point out just that the type of astrology that these people are doing is a very particular type of astrology that I'll come back to later in my talk. And that is, they're dealing on very large scales, right? They're talking about the passage of what's called the world year, right? Like these large astrological or astronomical, literally astronomical scales of time, eras of human history, figuring out sort of what the fates of people and dynasties and religions are. And all of this gets eventually systematized by the great 9th century sort of theoretician of astral sciences, Abu Mashar, who's really the one who formalizes a lot of what we now think of as Western astrology. For example, it's Abu Mashar who really lays out the framework for the small, medium, and large conjunctions that create this 960-year millennial framework on which so many sort of apocalyptic visions are later hung. I'll mention that later. That's really the subject of another talk that I'm not giving today, but I'm happy to talk about it if we need to. I bring up Abu Mashar though mostly because even as he was theorizing and sort of laying out the framework of astrology, he was also being forced to defend astrology against new attacks against it, right? So he was living at a time when there was a significant theological turn against Greek sciences, foreign sciences, and specifically astrology on a number of grounds. So for example, the idea that the stars had this sort of daimonic force over the world, or that the astrologer would have some sort of access to knowledge of the unknown that isn't really theologically feasible in a monotheistic prophetic world. And this causes trouble for astrologers like Abu Mashar. And even those people most associated with the Greek sciences, the Mutazilites, end up rejecting the science of astrology because it seems to deny the subject of, or deny humans their own free will, right? So George Saliba, again, has written a great article on this defense, sort of laying out the framework of it. And what we see is that from the 9th century, astrology has become sort of marginalized scientifically. It's been rejected by religious authorities. It ends up being critiqued by many scholars in subsequent centuries, but of course it continues to be practiced, right? So it continues to be practiced by people like Abu Mashar, but also by, hacks and charlatans in the marketplace. What's really interesting about the critiques levied against astrology is that the people who launch these critiques don't actually criticize the efficacy of astrology, right? They're not saying that it doesn't work. They're just saying sort of that it's not allowed. And so there continues to be this idea that astrology is a effective science. It's just not, it doesn't fit within sort of the acceptable framework of Islamic science. So it gets lumped into these practical applied arts like medicine and dream interpretation and any number of other things. Okay, so as part of this, I think we see an anxiety emerge on the part of the practitioners of astrology over the special status of their knowledge, right? The idea that astrology is a very highly specialized skill that requires a lot of study, a lot of math, a lot of memorization. But at the same time, it's a science that's increasingly being relegated to the applied realm, the daily application to people's lives. And so we see the work of someone like Al-Qabasi. So this is a 10th century scholar who writes a handbook of astrology that anybody can consult in order to sort of learn what they need to learn in order to practice some astrology. But at the same time, Al-Qabasi is writing test questions. Literally, he's writing exams that can be given to people to make sure that they are adequately knowledgeable, that they're not charlatans or faking it. Okay, so in short, we see over the 9th and 10th century a Orthodox Sunni religious reaction against and rejection of astrology, but its continued practice. And of course, the Orthodox Sunni religious authorities are not a hegemonic force in the Eastern Islamic world. And so space for these kinds of speculative sciences remain at some courts, and especially in Shiite and particularly Ismaili courts. So we see this, for example, in the court of the Hamdanids in Syria, where Al-Qabasi wrote his handbook for astrology. We see it in the Samanid context that gave rise to Ibn Sina, right? Really the greatest medieval proponent of a lot of these Greek foreign sciences. And we see it in particular in the significant patronage of the Nizari Ismaili imams in Kohistan and Iran. So that brings us back to one of the protagonists of today's talk, Nasruddin Tusi, who enters the picture really under the patronage of the Ismailis of northern and eastern Iran. First under the governor of Khorasan, and later working at Alamut under the direct patronage of the imams themselves. So during his time in Khorasan, Nasruddin Tusi does produce some theoretical astronomical works, but he's also, and this again, I'm really grateful to Tawfiq Haidarzadeh's chapter for pointing this out. He's really engaged in astrology during this time, right? So we know that he casts a horoscope for an Ismaili prince. He integrates astrology into his main sort of treatise on Ismaili doctrine, the Rawda-i-Taslim. So in that, he talks about how astrology, how the planets, for example, are involved in fetal development, or how horoscopes influence people's lives, but through the decree of the creator, sort of through God's will. This is a way to sort of sidestep the question of planets having demonic force. And he also even addresses the question of false prophets, right? Like what happens if someone is born at the same moment as a prophet and therefore has the same horoscope as a prophet? And he has a whole explanation about how prophecy and astrology relate to one another. Not in order to reject astrology, but in order to integrate it into a cosmological vision that's based on Ismaili Shiite theology. Okay, we also have several sets of electuary tables produced by Tusi. So I should pause here and talk a little bit about, return to the idea of different types of astrology. In the 8th and 9th century, we saw astrology happening on very broad scales, right? Dealing with the ages of people, with the world year, with dynasties and so forth. In Tusi's work, we tend to see, and in the work of later astrologers, I argue, we tend to see, again, sensibly, we see astrology applied to day-to-day applications. And really the most applicable form of astrology is what's called electuary or catarchic astrology, which is basically picking a good day to do something, right? When is it a good day to sell a house? Or when is it a good day to sow wheat? Or when is it a good day to get married, right? And so this is what I call electuary tables. And we have at least 3 sets of electuary tables that have survived from Nasruddin Tusi. I'll come back to these in a little bit, but it again, I haven't been able to dig into these enough. I don't know if any of these are dated at all, but it would surprise me to see that none of them came from the Ismaili period. I mean, really, they either came from the Ismaili period or they came from after the Ismaili period, and either one is really suggestive of the role of astrology in Nasruddin Tusi's work. So to summarize here on this first point, I know we're already halfway through the talk. At the time of the Mongol conquest, Tusi was engaged in many fields under the patronage of the Ismailis, including theoretical astronomy and philosophy, but also applied astrology. And I think we see this really well exemplified in, I'm going to share my screen again, in Al-Hanbali's, obituary notice of Tusi, where he says he was not the Nasr, not the helper of religion, but rather a helper of disbelief and heresy and polytheism, saving only the philosophers and astrologers, misappropriating to them the funds meant for religious schools, and denying in his books the resurrection, and holding to the pre-eternity of the world, building schools for heretics, and teaching instead of the Quran, the dabbling of the Imam of the Mulhids, Ibn Sina. So again, he's being associated here with these movements and individuals that have been sort of marginalized by other authorities. Okay, turning now to this idea of popularization. I'm going to sort of move through this pretty quickly because, well, in the interest of time, but also because it's kind of hypothetical. I want to start by turning to this popular Zoroastrian astrological tradition that Bruno and I and others have been working on, which is really represented in a series of texts produced over several centuries. So I think by comparing these texts to one another, we have a really neat opportunity to see historical processes at play, because these texts are all related exactly in that they're put in the voice of the legendary Zoroastrian sage Jamasp, And he claims this to have knowledge of the future of the world and the apocalypse because of his knowledge of astronomy. But he describes that in different ways in the three texts. So in the 9th or 10th century, we have Jamasp talking about how he has this magical art and wisdom. He knows all this special information, what the characteristics are of different people, and he can teach this to rulers and to men. A couple centuries later, in the Akami Jamasp, we hear Jamasp saying that he has completed the calculations. Again, he has this special knowledge of the stars and planets. But looking to the end of this quote, he says, "I have concealed those prophecies so that they'll be apparent to the masters of the stars." In other words, people who know this stuff will be able to understand this text. But if this book and these words are read by someone they were not intended for, they could not recognize them. And finally, in the Kitabi Hakim Jamasp, we read that if someone needs to know the circumstance, he should consult this book and will know all examples in it about the meaning of the hands and the stars. Basically saying, here you go, it's all spelled out. If you need to know something, just read this book. And I think what we see in here is the full range of anxieties on the part of the astrologer about astrology as a specialized knowledge that can be taught and requires some special training, but then also this general slide towards it being a more accessible art. Okay, so we see another side of the popularization of astrology in these texts when we look at how astrology is actually presented within them. So in the Ayadgari Jamaspig, he claims to know astrology, but we don't actually see astrology in action in the text. In the later texts, these texts are actually built around a series of horoscopes that are described in the text. And actually in the third one, the Kitabi Hakim Jamasp, we actually get diagrams of the horoscopes. And one of the things we're working on as a group is one of the discussions is that the question of when these diagrams were added to the text. But clearly they were added, if not at the same time, at least shortly after the composition of the text. And I think what that shows us is that the authors of these texts could count on increasing amounts of general astrological knowledge among their readership, right? Because in order for the reader to make sense of this kind of information, whether it be the description of the horoscopes or eventually the diagrams of the horoscopes, there has to be a general understanding of what they mean. Okay, so these texts are developing during the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries during a period when the Seljuk Turks are ruling over Iran. And I think we see a similar sort of shift in sort of increased knowledge about astrology when we look at the visual material, the material evidence from the Seljuk period. So we start to see the emergence of nativity charts with images of the constellations. And then we start to see these what are called electuary tables, right? This is a great example of an electuary table produced in the 12th century in Anatolia, which includes these images of the planets, which I'll touch on briefly here. And basically what these tables say, so this is on the right, the image of Jupiter and the image of Mars here on the left. And the tables at the bottom basically say, when the moon is in different aspects. So when the moon is next to one of these planets or across from these planets or at 90 degrees from one of these planets, what that means, it's a good time to do. So as I mentioned, we see an increase in these emergence of these electuary tables, which are really the most popular, the most applicable form of astrological science. And moving ahead then to the Mongol period, right up to the formal, the great observatory of Maraga, at least 3 of our greatest astronomers working at Maraga were also responsible for the writing of electuary tables. Nasruddin Tusi wrote at least 3, as I already mentioned. We have surviving tables also from Muhyiddin Maghribi and Qutbuddin Shirazi, both of whom were deeply involved in the work at Maraga, but also producing this sort of popular astrological work. Okay, I am actually going to skip over, we have some cool, here's some more electuary tables from the Safinai Tabriz, we have at least, by my sort of initial count, at least 6 electuary tables in this text, which was produced at the end of the Ilkhanid period. We have a lot of neat images about the planets emerging during the Seljuk period as well. I've already talked about these elsewhere, including on coins. So I'm going to skip over these for now in the interest of time, and instead move ahead to my third point, which is sort of the state of, or the Mongol understanding of astrology and their knowledge of Western astrologers in particular. So in 1267, we don't need to read that yet. In 1267, the Franciscan scholar Roger Bacon sent an 878-page letter to Pope Clement IV. And this treatise, which has gained the understated title of the Great Work, or the Opus Maius, was an effort to integrate Aristotelian sciences with Christian theology. Interestingly, Roger Bacon is doing pretty much the same thing that Nasruddin Tusi is trying to do. He's trying to integrate these Aristotelian sciences with a theological worldview. It's not a purely academic work, however, but Bacon writes a plea to the Latin Christian world to use all of the tools at its disposal to forestall what he sees as a coming apocalypse. And his defense of empirical scientific method has earned him praise as an early advocate of modern thought, but within that we have to recognize that he's also defending astrology, right, which has been largely dismissed by modern science. And in making his defense of astrology, Roger Bacon casts his eyes eastward, heeding the warning of his friend and fellow Franciscan William of Rubric, and he asserts that the Mongol victories of the previous decades had succeeded because of their reliance on astrology. So he writes, I write these things, all these sort of missives on science and the importance of science, because of the dangers that are happening and may happen to Christians in the Church of God through unbelievers, and especially through the Antichrist. Skipping down here. And thus the Tatars may cause the world to fall apart, Tatars and Saracens, for it is evident that the Tatars are more devoted to astronomy than others, because although there are wise astronomers in many nations, yet principates and republics are not governed by them. But those who among the Tatars are like the prelates among us are astronomers. So here he starts describing the shamans of the Mongol Empire. Mongol Khan said to the Christians assembled before him, including William of Rubric, we have a law from God through our diviners, and we do all that they say. And you Christians have the law from God through the prophets, but you do not do it. And therefore the Tatars proceed in all things by the way of astronomy and in forecasting the future and in the works of wisdom. So for Roger Bacon, the greatest potential threat to the Christian world would be a Mongol horde allied with the Islamic civilization that had produced Abu Mashar, who Roger Bacon was very eagerly reading. And of course, by 1267, when Roger Bacon wrote this, the Mongols had already inserted themselves into the civilization of the Eastern Islamic world, and they had hired the leading astral scientist of the age, Nasruddin Tusi. The observatory at Marga was in full operation, and Tusi had even cast a horoscope for the new Ilkhan Abaka. However, astrology had not made the Mongols invulnerable, as Kedbuka had learned to his detriment at Ain Jalut, and the Mongols had not made an alliance with the Saracens, who were foremost, to the Muslims who were foremost on the mind of late Crusade era Europeans. Indeed, exactly at the same time that Roger Bacon was writing this to Clement IV, Clement and Abaka were engaged in a correspondence attempting to coordinate a new crusade against the Mamluks. Now, Roger Bacon's assessment of the use of astrology by the Mongols is not unique. So Giovanni, for example, concludes that these people we have mentioned are called Kam, and when the Mongols had no knowledge of science, they had from ancient times yielded obedience to the words of these Kam, or shamans. And even now their princes still believe in their words and prayers, and if they engage upon some business, they will conclude nothing until these astrologers have given their consent. So he's conflating shamans and astrologers. And Kyriakos of Ganjak gives a similar report that the Mongols do nothing unless their, quote, sorcerers and magicians command it. So these passages seem to suggest that divination, including astrology, was an important concern among the Mongols, and that shamans played the role of astrologer in predicting at least the eclipses and possibly other celestial phenomena. However, elsewhere we read that these shamans were perhaps not as good at this astrology as might have been wished. So here we turn to our Chinese material, and we read on the funeral stela of Yelu Chucai that at the beginning of the dynasty, there was no calendrical science. The Turkestanis memorialized that on the night of the 15th of day of moon 5, there would be a lunar eclipse. Yelu Chucai said there would not be an eclipse, and indeed, at the time indicated there was no eclipse. The next year, Yelu Chucai memorialized that on the night of the 15th day of moon 10, there would be a lunar eclipse, and the Turkestanis said there would not be. That night, the moon was eclipsed by 80%. His Majesty was greatly amazed, so His Majesty, here's Genghis Khan, was greatly amazed by this and said, "There is nothing you do not understand about the affairs in the heavens. How much more you understand about the affairs of men." So in short, the impression we get of divination at the court of Genghis Khan is that celestial observations were one of several techniques used for determining auspicious times for activities. Or I should say, and that Yelu Chucai could, by his experience in this area, gain the confidence of the ruler. So where did Yelu Chucai gain this magical knowledge, to borrow Jamasp's terminology? Well, further down on his funerary stela, we get the answer. When he says, or the author writes that astronomy and calendrics, medicine and divination, mathematics and mental computation, musical pitch, Confucianism, Buddhism, and the scripts of various countries, there was none that he did not grasp thoroughly. Once he said that the understanding of the 5 planets is more precise in the Western calendar than in the Chinese one, and so he made the Martaba calendar, which should be the Turkestani name for calendar. Moreover, when he found that their measurements of solar eclipse progression differed from the Chinese because of accumulated discrepancies in the Da Ming and the Chinese calendar, he created a new almanac and promulgated it throughout the world. So here we get hints of where Yelu Chucai learned the skills that allowed him to out-divine his contemporaries at court. We have to remember that he had accompanied Genghis Khan on campaign in Central Asia between 1219 and 1222, and evidently while there he had learned some amount of astronomical calculation from the Turkestani scholar, the Muslim scholars in the region. And I argue that it was this new awareness of Western observational astronomy filtering into the Mongol court through the intervention of Yelu Chucai that drew the Mongols' attention westward for something better than the eclipse prognostications that were available at court. So we know, for example, from the report of Changchun's travel in Central Asia, that there was at least one Chinese astrologer working in Samarkand in 1222, which was the same year that Yelu Chucai predicted an eclipse. And in that same year, he also interpreted the appearance of Halley's Comet, further earning Genghis Khan's confidence. So it's easy to imagine that Yelu Chucai enjoyed privileged access to a scholarly community in Samarkand, either because he was simply accompanying Genghis Khan, or perhaps because of his shared Khitan Liao lineage with the recently deposed Kara-Hittite rulers of Central Asia. Mongol Iran has a really interesting chapter in the Idea of Iran series about the patronage of science among the Kara-Hittite rulers. And so I think we can see this as one sort of pivot point of Islamic sciences being picked up by Yelu Chucai and drawing the attention of the Mongol rulers, his patrons, westward. Okay. Thus, before the start of Hülegü's campaign west, let's see, I think, yeah, I can stop the screen share here. Well before the start of Hülegü's campaign westward, the Mongol court was already keen on the skills of Western astral scientists, even if they didn't know many of those astral scientists by name. Of course, we have accounts, and others, including some of you, have written about the work of an historian, Christian Issa Kelemechi, at the Order of Sorkaktani a few years after, in the 1240s, and Munke's initial sort of attempt to build or found an observatory under Jamaluddin of Bukhara. Clearly, there was a awareness of and an interest in the scholarship of Western scientists, Western astrologers at the Mongol court, and this I don't think has been discussed adequately. The shamans and other individuals working at Möncke's court in the 1250s, those shamans that William of Rubric and Juvayni describe predicting eclipses in the 1250s and 1260s, may have already been trained in some form of Western predictive methods that hadn't been available to the shamans of a previous generation, at whose expense Yalu Chutsai had gained Chinggis Khan's confidence. Okay, whether or not Möncke specifically knew about Nasruddin Tusi, I think, is an open question. But when we return to that anecdote on the road to Baghdad, and again, assuming that it reflects some aspect of reality, which is always problematic with Rashid ad-Din, I think we can see here we can get a little better insight into what these individuals were involved in, Husam ad-Din and Nasr ad-Din, in that specific anecdote. When Husam ad-Din offers his horoscope, which we've already looked at, he was confident of his position and free to speak boldly, while Nasr ad-Din was uncertain and cautious about his response. I suggest that this means that Hülegü went west intending to employ Islamic astral scientists, and he employed sort of the first ones who came to mind, or came to his court, and Husam ad-Din was probably one of those, whether this was in the Kara-Hittai realms or elsewhere, I'm not sure. When Nasr ad-Din joins the court of Hülegü, it's primarily as a sort of envoy with the Ismailis, but perhaps he sees, as Khadij Jaradi has written, that astrology could kind of be a meal ticket, right? So we see him sort of out astrologizing Husam ad-Din, or simply just out arguing him, and elsewhere using sort of astrology when it becomes advantageous to do so. The difference really is, though, that Nasruddin Tusi at least really knows his stuff, right? He knows the math, he knows the astronomy, he knows the astrology. He's not afraid of the astrology. He certainly isn't rejecting it the way that other scholars have. And he's perfectly happy to use either, whether it be his rhetorical skills or his astrological skills, to work his way into Ilkhanid favor. So briefly, just to finish up, comparing my position, sort of my current position with those of others, I think I come down somewhere between George Salaba and Tawfiq Haidarzadeh with regard to Mongol views on astrology. I think that the early Mongol rulers did seek out diviners, including astrologers, as George Salaba suggests, and they searched for experts in all these fields to provide one more layer of spiritual assurance in their political projects. In the final calculation, however, the decision to heed or ignore an astrological prognostication was a political one. As for Tusi, as serious of a scientist as he was, I think that we can say, as Tawfiq Haidarzadeh has said, that he saw astrology as more than just a meal ticket, and he was actually personally and intellectually engaged and invested in it, even if he was also willing to sort of use it to accomplish very specific political ends. And there's some funny anecdotes we can talk about with regard to this. More importantly, though, I think we need to recognize that the Mongols and Muslim, both the Mongol and Islamic experiences with astrology were shaped by historical processes. For the Mongols, this included the process during the early years of the empire of learning about the quality of Western Asian Islamic astral specialists. In the Islamic world, historical ideas about the limitations of human knowledge and the appropriate nature of foreign sciences, the appropriate place of foreign sciences, meant that a scholar like Nasruddin Tusi could develop a scholarly practice that included astrology under the patronage of Ismaili imams, while elsewhere the population of the region became increasingly familiar with the symbols and terminology of astrology as it could be applied to everyday life. So all of this, I guess, just to maybe just to give one final spectacular slide, which I think I have queued up here. Yeah, all of this contributes to astrology becoming, during the Mongol period, an acceptable expression of royal ideology. We see this most notably in the emergence of the idea of the millennial sovereign, as described by Asfar Moin for the Timurid and Mughal courts. Yeah, such an explicit embrace of astrological ideas would have been problematic in previous centuries for various reasons. First of all, because of the problematic nature of astrology, but also because of the lack of general familiarity with this, these ideas and these images. Such an explicit embrace of astrological ideas would have been problematic in previous centuries, yet it was entirely built on the ideas that developed during those same centuries. And I will leave it there for discussion.